At 07:10 hours on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder stood in a British landing craft assault boat, watching German machine gunners position themselves at the edge of 100-foot cliffs that would determine whether his surrounded forces survived the next 48 hours. Rudder commanded Force A of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, Companies D, E, and F, 225 men total, arriving 40 minutes late to a beach at the base of Point du Hoc, a promontory jutting into the English Channel between Utah and Omaha beaches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 34 years old, from Eden, Texas, Texas A, and M graduate who finished in 1932. He was a high school football coach who'd been called to active duty in 1941. The Rangers were supposed to land at 06:30 during the last moments of naval bombardment when German defenders would still be stunned and disoriented. Instead, they arrived at 07:10 in full daylight, with Germans fully recovered and repositioned at the cliff edges. The navigation error had cost them 40 minutes and any element of surprise. Rudder's force was supposed to climb these cliffs under fire, reach the top, and destroy 6 French-made 155mm guns that could rain shells on 50,000 American troops landing on Utah and Omaha beaches. Intelligence said those guns could fire 25,000 yards, covering every ship in the channel, every landing craft approaching shore, every soldier struggling through the surf. Allied planners had bombed Point du Hoc repeatedly in April, May, and June. The battleship USS Texas and destroyers USS Satterlee and HMS Talibont had pounded the position that morning. But the guns had to be destroyed by ground assault, because there was no certainty that bombs and shells had done the job. Here's what Rudder didn't know as his landing craft approached the beach. What Allied intelligence believed was a battery of 6 powerful coastal artillery pieces was actually an empty position. The Germans had moved the guns weeks earlier to avoid the bombardments, but here's what the Germans didn't understand. By forcing Rudder's Rangers to climb those cliffs and hold that position for 48 hours, they were about to turn what should have been a German victory into one of the costliest defensive failures of D-Day. Rudder knew something was wrong because of the cliff approaching his landing craft. The sand tables and aerial photographs he'd studied for months showed Point du Hoc with distinct features, specific landmarks, recognizable terrain. What he was looking at through the smoke and spray bore no resemblance to any photograph. The Allied bombardment had transformed the landscape into something that resembled the surface of the moon. The carefully prepared assault plan had assumed recognizable landmarks for navigation. Those landmarks no longer existed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. First Sergeant Leonard Lommel, 24 years old, from Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, was in one of the 9 British landing craft carrying Rudder's force. Lommel commanded the lead platoon of Company D. He'd volunteered for the Rangers after serving with the 76th Infantry Division, had gone through the brutal commando training course in Scotland, had spent months practicing cliff assaults on the Isle of Wight. Lommel knew the mission was considered suicide. Allied planners estimated 70% casualties. One naval intelligence officer had said it plainly. 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing that cliff, but Lommel also knew the mathematics that made the mission necessary. If those 6 155mm guns remained operational, they could fire on both landing beaches simultaneously. Each gun could fire 4 rounds per minute. With 25,000 yards of range, they could hit targets 14 miles away. That meant every transport ship, every landing craft, every soldier on 2 beaches was in their killing zone. The guns had to be destroyed before H-hour on the main beaches, or thousands of men would die in the surf before they ever reached French soil. The Rangers had trained for this specific mission since January 1944. They'd climbed cliffs at Swanage on England's southern coast until they could do it in darkness, in rain, under simulated fire. They'd practiced with rocket-propelled grapnel hooks that could throw ropes and rope ladders to the top of 100-foot cliffs. They'd rehearsed with extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, mounted on WWIs, amphibious trucks that could approach the cliff base and extend their ladders while under fire. The entire battalion had been built around this one mission. Take Point du Hoc, destroy the guns, hold the position until relieved. As Lammel's landing craft approached the beach, German machine gun fire began raking the boats. Lammel was hit immediately, a bullet striking his side as the ramp dropped. He ran into waist-deep water, felt the underwater crater beneath his feet, nearly disappeared into the slippery clay bottom. Other rangers were drowning in craters they couldn't see, pulled down by 60 pounds of equipment, struggling in clay that made climbing out nearly impossible. The beach at the base of the cliff was only a few yards wide at high tide. The rangers had maybe 20 feet of rocky shingle before the cliff face began its vertical rise. German defenders at the top were throwing grenades over the edge, firing machine guns straight down, cutting the ropes as soon as they caught on the cliff edge. The grapnel hooks fired from the landing craft were falling short because the ropes were wet from spray, heavier than expected, reducing the rocket's range. Some rangers started climbing anyway, using bayonets driven into the clay face, grabbing at roots and rocks, pulling themselves up while Germans fired down at them. The USS Satterlee, a destroyer positioned offshore, began firing directly at the cliff top, 5-inch shells landing so close to the climbing rangers that they could feel the concussion. The naval gunfire was keeping Germans away from the cliff edge, giving the rangers those critical first minutes to get ropes secured and start the ascent. Lammel made it to the cliff base, grabbed a rope ladder, started climbing despite the bullet wound in his side. Below him, rangers were firing up at the cliff edge with Browning automatic rifles, suppressing German positions, covering the climbers. The ropes were slippery from seawater. The clay face was crumbling under their weight. Germans were cutting ropes, but they avoided the ropes that had burning phosphorus flares attached, mistakenly believing the flares were explosives. Technical Sergeant William Petty from Company D was the first ranger to reach the top at approximately 0720, 10 minutes after landing. He pulled himself over the edge, fired his rifle at the nearest German position, and held the ground while others climbed up beside him. Within 30 minutes, roughly 70 rangers had reached the summit. The rest were dead, wounded, or still struggling up the cliff face. Rudder established his command post in a shell crater near the cliff edge, close enough that he could still receive naval gunfire support if needed, far enough back that he had some protection from German artillery. He immediately sent runners to the gun positions. The intelligence maps showed 6 circular concrete casemates arranged in an arc facing the sea. The Rangers needed to destroy those guns before German reinforcements could arrive. What the runners reported back changed everything. The gun casemates were empty. Some held telephone poles set up to resemble gun barrels when viewed from the air. Some held nothing at all. The 6 155mm guns that were the entire reason for this assault had been removed from their positions. The Rangers had just conducted one of the most difficult amphibious assaults in military history to capture a position that no longer held its primary objective. Lammel, despite his wound, immediately understood what this meant. If the guns weren't here, they were somewhere close. The Germans wouldn't move them far because these were coastal defense weapons with a specific mission. They'd been moved to avoid bombardment, but they'd be positioned where they could still perform their mission, which meant they were inland, probably camouflaged, ready to fire on the beaches once the invasion began. Rudder's orders had covered this possibility. If their guns weren't in the casemates, the Rangers were to push inland to the coastal road that ran from Grand Camp to Vierville, establish a blocking position, and prevent German reinforcements from moving between the 2 American landing beaches. They would also patrol south to search for the missing guns. The mission hadn't failed. It had simply changed from assault to search and destroy. Lammel took a patrol from Company D and moved south through the cratered landscape toward the coastal road. The bombardment had destroyed every building, every tree, every feature that might provide reference points. What should have been a simple navigation exercise became a careful advance through terrain that looked like the surface of another planet. Shell craters 20 feet across and 15 feet deep, overlapping, filled with water and debris. broken concrete bunkers, twisted steel reinforcing bars, unexploded ordnance everywhere. They reached the coastal road at approximately 0800 hours. The road was unpaved, barely wide enough for two vehicles, running east-west behind the German coastal defences. Lommel positioned his men on both sides of the road in hasty defensive positions. If German reinforcements tried to move along this road toward Omaha Beach, they'd run straight into 30 Rangers armed with machine guns, rifles, and anti-tank weapons. Then Lommel noticed something. Deep tire tracks in the road, leading south into the hedgerows. Heavy tracks, the kind made by large vehicles or heavy equipment. Lommel looked at Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, his second in command. The tracks were fresh, recent, unmistakable. Lommel made the decision that would justify the entire assault on Pointe du Hoc. He told Kuhn to come with him. They were going to follow those tracks. The two Rangers moved south along a sunken lane bordered by hedgerows, weapons ready, expecting German infantry at any moment. They covered 250 yards through the Norman bocage, the distinctive hedgerow country that would become notorious in the battles to come. The tracks led to an orchard, camouflaged with netting, hidden from aerial observation. Lommel held up his hand, stopped Kuhn, half-whispered what he was seeing. There they were, the guns. All 5 of them, positioned in a line, barrels elevated 30 to 40 degrees, aimed toward Utah Beach. French-made GPF 155mm guns on field carriages, capable of firing 4 rounds per minute, with ranges exceeding 25,000 yards. Mountains of ammunition stacked beside each gun. And across the orchard, about 100 yards away, approximately 100 German soldiers, the gun crews and guards, apparently gathered for morning formation. The guns were unguarded. The Germans were focused on their officers, receiving orders for the day, completely unaware that 2 American Rangers were standing 200 feet away, looking at the artillery pieces that were supposed to be secure behind. German lines. Lommel never hesitated. He told Kuhn to cover him. He was going to disable those guns. Lommel ran across the open ground to the first gun. He pulled a thermite grenade from his web gear, activated it, and jammed it into the traversing mechanism. The thermite burned at thousands of degrees, melting the steel gears that allowed the gun to rotate and elevate. The gun was now useless. He moved to the second gun, did the same thing. 2 guns destroyed with the 2 thermite grenades he was carrying. He used the butt of his Thompson submachine gun to smash the sights on the remaining 3 guns, rendering them incapable of accurate fire. Then he and Kuhn ran back toward the coastal road. They needed more thermite grenades to finish the job properly. They found other Rangers from their platoon, collected every thermite grenade the men were carrying, approximately 6 grenades, and ran back to the orchard. Kuhn took up an overwatch position, rifle trained on the German formation, across the field. Lommel placed thermite grenades on the remaining 3 guns, pulled the pins, and sprinted back to cover. The grenades detonated with brilliant white flashes, temperatures reaching 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, melting the breech blocks and traversing mechanisms into useless chunks of metal. All 5 guns permanently disabled. The German gun crews ran toward the position, but by then Lommel and Kuhn were gone, moving back through the hedgerows toward their defensive positions on the coastal road. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It was approximately 08:45 hours on June 6, 1944. Less than 90 minutes after landing, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had accomplished its primary mission. Not in the way anyone had planned, not by destroying guns in concrete casemates, but by aggressive patrolling, quick thinking, and the initiative of 2 sergeants who followed tire tracks into an orchard. Rudder received word that the guns were destroyed. He radioed back to the command ship. Mission accomplished. The 2nd Ranger Battalion became the first major unit on D-Day to report complete success of its assigned objectives. But the Rangers' ordeal was just beginning. They now held a piece of ground deep behind German lines, with German forces on 3 sides and the ocean at their backs. They were isolated, outnumbered, running low on ammunition, and completely dependent on reinforcements that were supposed to come from Omaha Beach. Reinforcements that were pinned down on the bloodiest beach of D-Day and might never arrive. The German reaction to the loss of Pointe du Hoc was immediate and furious. General Dietrich Kreyss commanded the German 352nd Infantry Division, responsible for defending the entire Omaha Beach sector and the coastal area west to the WWII River. 55 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front, experienced commander who understood mobile defense and counterattack tactics. His headquarters were at Molay-Litry, 9 miles from Pointe du Hoc, close enough that he received reports about the American assault within minutes of it happening. Kreyss's initial assessment was that Pointe du Hoc was a diversion, a small-scale raid meant to draw German attention away from the main landing beaches. Then his intelligence officer reported that American paratroopers had landed inland, that naval bombardment was hitting the entire coast, that this was the invasion. Kreyss immediately ordered his reserve regiment, the 915th Grenadier Regiment, to move toward the coast. He also ordered elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, positioned west of Omaha Beach near Pointe du Hoc, to recapture the position. The 2nd Battalion of the 914th Grenadier Regiment was closest to Pointe du Hoc, positioned at the village of WWII, less than a mile inland. The battalion commander received orders at approximately 0830 hours. Counterattack the American position. Recapture Pointe du Hoc. Destroy the Americans who have landed there. The German commander organized his available forces, approximately 2 companies of infantry, roughly 200 men, supported by machine guns and mortars. They moved toward Pointe du Hoc through the hedgerows, approaching from the south and east. The first German probe came at approximately 1100 hours. A platoon-sized element, maybe 40 men, advancing up the coastal road toward the Rangers' blocking position. The Germans were moving cautiously, using the hedgerows for cover, probing for American positions. They made it to within 100 yards before the Rangers opened fire. M1 Garans, Browning automatic rifles, light machine guns, all firing simultaneously into the German formation. The attack broke within minutes. The Germans pulled back, leaving their dead on the road, trying to figure out how many Americans were actually there. Rudder, monitoring the situation from his command post, understood what was happening. The Germans were testing the defences, trying to determine Ranger strength and positions. The real attack would come later, with more forces, better coordination, artillery support. The Rangers had maybe 4 hours before that happened. 4 hours to improve their positions, redistribute ammunition, prepare for what was coming. The problem was supplies. The Rangers had landed with minimal ammunition, expecting to be resupplied quickly once the position was secure. Each rifleman had carried 96 rounds for his M1 Garand, 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke grenade. Machine gunners had carried 800 rounds. That sounds like a lot until you consider what they'd already expended climbing the cliffs, clearing the casemates, fighting their way to the coastal road. By noon on D-Day, some Rangers were down to less than 20 rounds per rifle. Medical supplies were worse. The battalion had landed with minimal medical equipment because they'd expected to evacuate casualties quickly to the ships offshore. Instead, the wounded were piling up in the command post area, with nowhere to go. The Navy wasn't sending landing craft back to evacuate wounded because German artillery was still firing on the beach approaches. The Rangers battalion surgeon, Captain Walter Block, was performing emergency field surgery in a shell hole with almost no supplies, no plasma, no morphine for the worst cases. Food was non-existent. The Rangers had eaten breakfast on the transport ships at 0300 hours. Most had vomited it up during the rough crossing to shore. They had no rations, no water resupply, nothing. They'd have to hold Pointe du Hoc on empty stomachs while fighting German infantry that was being reinforced, resupplied, and supported by artillery. At 1825 hours on June 6th, General Kreyss issued specific orders to the 914th Grenadier Regiment. The 1st Company must counterattack at Pointe du Hoc to resolve the situation. Detachments from WWII must attack from the east. This was no longer a probe. This was a coordinated assault with company-sized forces, roughly 150 to 200 men, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The attack came at 19:25 hours, just before sunset. German infantry advancing through the hedgerows, using the failing light for concealment, moving in squad-sized elements with fire and maneuver tactics. They'd learned from the earlier probe that charging straight up the road was suicide. Now they were being more careful, more professional, using terrain and combined arms. The Rangers on the coastal road held their positions and returned fire. They had good defensive positions, had pre-sighted their weapons on likely avenues of approach, had fields of fire that covered the hedgerows, but they were outnumbered at least 3-1, and the Germans had artillery support. German mortars began falling on the Ranger positions, 81mm rounds landing with devastating accuracy. The battle continued until darkness. The Germans pushed closer, got within grenade-throwing range of some Ranger positions, but couldn't break through the defensive line. The Rangers held, barely, trading fire with Germans they couldn't see in the darkness, listening to wounded men crying for medics on both sides. At approximately 2300 hours, the Germans launched another attack. 40 men from the 1st Company of the 914th Regiment, attacking straight toward Rudder's command post from the east. This attack was more determined, better coordinated. The Germans got into the crater field, started working their way through the shell holes toward the American positions, throwing grenades, firing at point-blank range. Rangers from Company E, positioned nearest the attack, fought back with everything they had. Hand-to-hand combat in some craters, men fighting with knives and rifle butts when they ran out of ammunition. The attack was stopped, but it cost the Rangers heavily. Company E lost approximately 20 men killed or wounded in that one engagement. And worse, several Rangers were captured when they didn't hear the order to withdraw to tighter defensive positions and got cut off in the outer craters. The Germans now held prisoners who could tell them exactly how few Rangers were actually on Point du Hoc, how low their ammunition was, how desperate their situation had become. At 0300 hours on June 7th, the Germans launched what they intended to be the final attack. 3 companies, roughly 300 men, attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. This was the main effort. Coordinated artillery preparation, infantry assault, everything the 914th Regiment could throw at the Rangers' position. The artillery barrage was devastating. German 105mm howitzers pre-registered on the Ranger positions, firing for effect. High explosive rounds landing every few seconds, tearing apart the defensive positions the Rangers had built, collapsing craters, burying men alive. Rudder's command post took a direct hit. He was wounded by shrapnel, bleeding from multiple wounds, but refused evacuation and continued directing the defense. Then came the infantry. 300 Germans advancing through the darkness, using the lingering smoke from the artillery barrage for concealment. They hit the Rangers' perimeter from the south and east simultaneously. The fighting was desperate, confused, brutal. Rangers firing at muzzle flashes, throwing their last grenades, using captured German weapons when they ran out of ammunition for their own. The Germans broke through the outer defensive line, pushed the Rangers back toward the cliff edge. Company D lost its position on the coastal road. Company E pulled back from the forward craters. The Rangers were being compressed into an ever smaller perimeter around Rudder's command post, fewer than 100 men still able to fight, surrounded on 3 sides by German infantry, with their backs to a 100-foot cliff and the ocean below. Rudder pulled his forces back to a final defensive line approximately 300 yards from the cliff edge. Every Ranger who could still hold a weapon was on that line. The wounded who could shoot were given rifles and told to find cover. The battalion was on the edge of destruction, minutes away from being overrun completely. But they held that line. They stopped the German advance 50 yards short of the command post, trading fire at ranges so close they could hear German officers shouting orders, could see the silhouettes of attacking infantry in the darkness. At 0430 hours, the German attack stopped. Not because the WWII Germans were beaten, but because they'd accomplished what they thought was enough. They'd driven the Rangers back, recaptured most of the ground around Point du Hoc, inflicted heavy casualties, and isolated the remaining Americans in a tiny defensive perimeter. They could finish the job in daylight when they could see what they were shooting at, when they could coordinate their fire properly, when they had better visibility for artillery observers. The Germans pulled back to reorganize, assuming the Rangers would either surrender at dawn or be easily destroyed in a final assault. What the Germans didn't know was that 48 Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion and one stray platoon from the 116th Infantry Regiment had fought their way through from Omaha Beach during the night of June 6th. 23 Rangers, led by Lieutenant Charles Parker, reached Rudder's position at approximately 2100 hours on June 6th, bringing desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. More importantly, the Germans didn't know that the Rangers had no intention of surrendering or retreating. They'd accomplished their mission. They'd destroyed the guns. They'd held the coastal road long enough to prevent German reinforcements from moving freely during the critical first hours of the invasion. They'd fixed German forces in place that should have been counterattacking on Omaha Beach. Now they would hold this ground until relieved or until every Ranger was dead. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. June 7th, dawn. Rudder counted his effective strength. Approximately 90 men capable of bearing arms. That was out of 225 who had landed 36 hours earlier. 70% casualties, exactly what the planners had predicted. But the Rangers were still holding Point du Hoc. They'd compressed their defensive perimeter to roughly 200 yards, pulled back from the coastal road, abandoned the outer craters, but they still controlled the cliff edge and the approach routes. The Germans launched another attack at 0800 hours. Company-sized force, approximately 150 men, attacking from the south with mortar and artillery support. This time the Germans were more cautious, having learned that the Rangers were still dangerous despite their desperate situation. The attack was methodical, professional, using proper fire and movement tactics. But the Rangers had advantages the Germans didn't fully understand. Naval gunfire support from the USS Satterlee was still available, and the destroyer's 5-inch guns could hit targets danger close to Ranger positions with devastating accuracy. Rudder had a naval gunfire control party with direct communication to the ship. When the German attack developed, Rudder called for fire. The naval shells landed within 50 yards of the Ranger defensive line, tearing apart the German assault formation, forcing them back before they could close to effective infantry engagement range. The German commanders were learning what commanders at Bastogne would learn 6 months later. Attacking a small, determined force that controls critical terrain, has prepared defensive positions, and possesses superior firepower support is exponentially more costly than the numbers suggest. The Rangers might have been outnumbered 10-1, but they were defending from prepared positions, had pre-registered fire plans, knew exactly where the Germans would have to come from, and could call down naval gunfire that the Germans had no answer for. Throughout June 7th, the Germans continued probing attacks, trying to find weak points in the Ranger perimeter, but never committing to a full-scale assault. They were taking heavy casualties for no gain. Every attack cost them 20, 30, 40 men. Were being ground down, but so were the Germans. And critically, every German soldier committed to attacking Point du Hoc was a soldier who wasn't fighting on Omaha Beach or moving to counterattack the expanding Allied beachhead. The situation on Omaha Beach during June 6th and 7th explains why reinforcements didn't reach Point du Hoc until June 8th. The landing at Omaha was a near disaster, the bloodiest of all D-Day beaches. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had suffered terrible casualties on the beach, had barely established a foothold on French soil, were fighting desperately just to survive. The rest of the 2nd Ranger Battalion and the entire 5th Ranger Battalion had landed on Omaha and been thrown immediately into the fight for the beach exits. Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers, along with the entire 5th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, had been the contingency force. If Rudder's Force A succeeded in taking Point du Hoc and sent the success signal by 0700 hours, These Rangers would land at Point du Hoc to reinforce. If no signal came by 0700 hours, they would land at Omaha Beach and assault Point du Hoc from the land side. Rudder's navigation error meant his landing craft arrived at 0710, 10 minutes after the deadline. Schneider never received the success signal, so he took his Rangers to Omaha Beach, landing in the Dog Green sector near Vierville. Company A and B of the 2nd Rangers landed there alongside Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment. They were slaughtered. Company A of the 116th lost 96% of its strength in the first 10 minutes on the beach. Killed, wounded, pinned down under German fire so intense that men couldn't move, couldn't advance, couldn't do anything but try to survive. The Rangers fared slightly better because of their training and discipline, but they still took horrific casualties. Of the approximately 500 Rangers who landed on Omaha Beach, over 200 were killed or wounded in the first hours. Those Rangers who survived the beach organized under fire, found leaders, and began fighting their way inland. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, found Schneider's Rangers pinned behind the seawall at Vierville. Cotter yelled at them, told them they were Rangers, told them Rangers were supposed to lead the way, told them to get off this beach before they all died there. The Rangers followed Schneider up the bluff, through the German wire, over the mines, and into Vierville. They were the first organized unit to breach the German defences at Omaha Beach, but that meant the Rangers were committed to the fight for Vierville, couldn't be extracted to move west toward Point du Hoc. General Charles Gerhardt, commander of the 29th Infantry Division, needed those Rangers to hold Vierville and protect his division command post. He denied repeated requests from Rudder to send the Rangers west to reinforce Point du Hoc. The Rangers at Point du Hoc would have to hold on their own. During the evening of June 7th, a small relief force finally broke through. One company from the 116th Infantry Regiment, maybe 80 men, pushed west from Omaha Beach through German positions, lost 30 men to snipers and small ambushes, and reached Rudder's perimeter at approximately 2100 hours. 80 fresh soldiers, with ammunition, medical supplies, and food. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain the defence for another day. June 8th, 0800 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder looked at his depleted battalion and knew they couldn't hold much longer. The Rangers had been in continuous combat for 48 hours. They'd had no sleep, almost no food, minimal water. Men were collapsing from exhaustion. Wounded were dying from infections, because there were no antibiotics. Ammunition was critically low again, despite the resupply from the 116th Infantry. The Rangers had held Point du Hoc for 2 days against a German regiment, but they were finished as a combat-effective unit. Then the sound of tank engines came from the south. American tank engines, the lead tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion, attached to the 29th Infantry Division, crashed through the hedgerows into the Ranger perimeter at 1100 hours on June 8th. Behind them came 3 full battalions of the 116th Infantry Regiment, over 2,000 men, finally pushing through from Omaha Beach. The siege of Point du Hoc was over. The Rangers were relieved. Medical evacuation began immediately, getting the wounded back to aid stations, then to ships, then to hospitals in England. The dead were collected, identified, prepared for burial. The survivors, those who could still walk, were pulled off the line and sent to rest areas. Final accounting. Of 225 Rangers who landed at Point du Hoc on June 6th, 77 were killed, 152 wounded, and 38 initially listed as missing but later determined to be captured, killed, or wounded. Approximately 90 Rangers were still combat-capable when relief arrived on June 8th. A 70% casualty rate, sustained over 48 hours, defending a position against a force that outnumbered them at minimum 5-1, often 10-1 during the major attacks. German casualties around Point du Hoc are harder to determine precisely because German unit records from this period are incomplete or were destroyed. But Ranger after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and battlefield assessment by American intelligence officers provide estimates. The 2nd Battalion of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, which bore primary responsibility for counterattacking Pointe du Hoc, reported heavy losses. Company strength units that attacked on June 6 with 150 to 200 men were reduced to 50 to 80 effective by June 8. The German forces committed to attacking Pointe du Hoc over 48 hours likely totaled 500 to 800 men when counting all the platoon and company-sized attacks. German casualties, based on Ranger reports of enemy killed observed on the battlefield and prisoner statements about losses, likely ranged between 150 and 250 killed and wounded. Those are conservative estimates based on verified observations, not speculation. The strategic impact of Pointe du Hoc exceeded the tactical results. The Rangers accomplished their primary mission by destroying the 5 155mm guns, which prevented those guns from firing on Utah and Omaha beaches during the critical first hours when thousands of troops were most vulnerable. That alone justified that entire operation. But the Rangers also accomplished something arguably more important by fixing German forces in place. The German 2nd Battalion of the 914th Grenadier Regiment should have been counterattacking on Omaha Beach, reinforcing the defenders there, helping to push the Americans back into the sea. Instead, they spent 48 hours attacking a Ranger position they couldn't capture, bleeding themselves against prepared defenses, accomplishing nothing strategically. Every German soldier committed to attacking Pointe du Hoc was a soldier who wasn't available for the crucial fights at Omaha and Utah beaches. General Crace, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, made a critical error by committing significant forces to recapture Pointe du Hoc instead of writing off the position and focusing his reserves on the main landing beaches. His reserves, which should have launched coordinated counterattacks against the beachheads during June 6, when American forces were most vulnerable, were instead fragmented and committed piecemeal to various tactical problems, including Pointe du Hoc. The 2nd Battalion of the 914th Grenadier Regiment was essentially destroyed as a combat-effective unit, not because the Rangers killed every German soldier, but because the battalion lost its combat cohesion, suffered casualties that rendered it incapable of offensive operations, and wasted 2 critical days attacking a position that didn't matter strategically once the guns were destroyed. For Rudder personally, Pointe du Hoc established his reputation as one of the finest combat commanders in the European theatre. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's 2nd highest award for valour, with a citation that praised his extraordinary heroism, his inspirational leadership under fire, and his refusal to be evacuated, despite being wounded twice. 13 other Rangers received the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions at Pointe du Hoc. The entire 2nd Ranger Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation. Rudder continued to lead Rangers throughout the war. He commanded the battalion in the assault on Brest, one of the most heavily fortified ports in France. He led the Rangers in the Hurtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest battles American forces fought in Europe. On December 7, 1944, he was promoted and given command of the 109th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division. He led that regiment through the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, Rudder returned to Texas. He became mayor of Brady from 1946 to 1952. He was elected Texas Land Commissioner in 1955 and served until 1958. Then he returned to Texas A&M University, first as vice president, then as president in 1959. He transformed Texas A&M from a small military college into a major research university, making Corps of Cadets membership optional, admitting women for the first time, and overseeing massive expansion of academic programs and enrollment. Rudder died on March 23, 1970, at age 59 from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was buried with full military honors. Texas A&M named multiple buildings after him, including Rudder Tower, a 12-story building that commemorates the 100-foot cliffs his Rangers climbed on D-Day. A statue of Rudder stands on campus. Military historians consistently rank him among the finest combat leaders America produced during World War II. First Sergeant Leonard Lamell, the ranger who found and destroyed the guns, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Pointe du Hoc. He also received the Silver Star for his actions at Hill 400 in the Hurtgen Forest, though that medal wasn't actually presented to him until 2007, 62 years after he earned it. Lamell was wounded 3 times during the war. He returned to New Jersey after his discharge, became a successful lawyer and judge, and spent decades advocating for proper recognition of Ranger contributions to D-Day. Historian Stephen Ambrose identified Lamell as possibly the single individual other than General Eisenhower who made the greatest difference to the success of D-Day. By destroying those 5 guns before they could fire on the beaches, Lamell likely saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. The guns were in position, had ammunition, and had clear fields of fire on Utah Beach. If they'd opened fire during the landing, the carnage would have been catastrophic. Lamell died on March 1, 2011, at age 91, one of the last surviving Rangers from Pointe du Hoc. The German perspective on Pointe du Hoc reveals the cost of General Crace's decision to counterattack the position. Crace survived D-Day, but was wounded during the fighting around Saint-Lô in early August 1944. He died of his wounds on August 2, 1944. After-action interviews with surviving German officers from the 352nd Infantry Division identified several critical errors during the D-Day fighting. The most significant was the fragmentation of reserves. Instead of concentrating his reserve regiment for a powerful counterattack against one landing beach, Crace split his forces to address multiple tactical problems simultaneously. The 915th Grenadier Regiment, his main reserve, was broken up and committed piecemeal. One battalion went to fight the American paratroopers near the Virey River. Another battalion was sent to counterattack British forces on Gold Beach. The remaining forces were split between reinforcing the Omaha Beach defenders and attacking Pointe du Hoc. No single commitment was strong enough to be decisive. The Germans ended up losing everywhere because they weren't strong enough anywhere. The battalion committed to Pointe du Hoc accomplished nothing except depleting itself against Rangers who couldn't be dislodged without committing forces the Germans couldn't afford to spare. A more experienced commander might have recognized that once the guns were destroyed, Pointe du Hoc ceased to be strategically important. The Rangers there could be contained, surrounded, and dealt with later. The real crisis was on the beaches, where tens of thousands of Allied troops were landing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.